Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
This is an important discussion, and Bob Woodward yesterday in her piercing conversation, thanks for the many comments there, particularly from Trump supporters that felt Mr. Woodward was supporting the other team. And to have Tina Fordham with us right now, Fordham Global Insights, is important off what Bob Woodward said yesterday, that the Secretary of Defense of the Biden administration has an affinity for the Vice President of the United States. Tina, as I know you know, in Foreign Affairs magazine, the Secretary of Defense writing, and of course his extreme concern about Ukraine and, quote, Putin's aggression, unquote, the Secretary of Defense goes, "The frauds and falsehoods of the Kremlin apologists." What does the Department of Defense and our foreign policy projection look like with a Trump or Harris victory?
Well, I think we should admit to start with that as we've gotten closer to polling day in the U.S., the sounding the alarm about the risks of Trump in the White House have increased, and the Defense Secretary is talking about the fact that Trump has said that he would end the war in Ukraine on day one. He hasn't said how he would do that. But what is likely the biggest foreign policy implication in the short term of Trump in the White House has got to be his promised end to military aid to Ukraine. Even though Europe has done a lot and done it quickly in European Union terms, and the UK has been very involved in this, it won't be possible to replace that aid in time. And, Putin's been playing a waiting game when it comes to Ukraine, and he's been much more active when it comes to U.S. elections.
Tina, you're based in London. I'd love to get a sense of kind of what the folks in the UK are thinking about this election, how closely they're paying attention to it. How do they view potential outcomes?
Well, I mean, I guess I have a bit of a, self-selected crowd around me. My phone is lighting up constantly today. And in the UK, people feel very close to the United States. And so there's, affinity and concern on that front. And of course, in the markets, our investor clients and corporate clients are really on the edge of their seats about this. It's impossible to position for an election as close as this, as Tom was saying at the start. But there is enormous anxiety, and it's pretty much across the board about what it would mean for the UK and Europe to have Trump back in the White House. And I think there's been less consideration really about what a Harris presidency would mean, apart from the expectation of continuity on NATO, AUKUS, the security umbrella in Asia.
What have you heard, if anything, from some of the European leaders about a potential second Trump presidency in terms of just geopolitics in general? Again, as you mentioned, there's so many hotspots around the world, from the Middle East to Ukraine. What would that mean potentially?
Well, European elected officials will be at great pains not to say anything because, they don't want to be seen to be interfering in the elections. But there has been no secret about the fact that Brussels, for example, has been trying to Trump-proof Europe. And that's the term that's been used. And that relates particularly to security and defense, as mentioned. But I think the other angle here, the obvious one is security and defense, and it matters enormously. But the other angle about why these U.S. elections are being watched so closely and with so much anxiety is simply around the question about whether the U.S. can have a peaceful transition. And I was very interested to see some polling data from the AP that talked about 4 in 10 Americans are concerned about violent interference with elections. That's alarming. So I think the biggest litmus test is the functioning of our institutions and the acquiescence of whoever loses.
Right. One of the great changes here, Tina, from 2016 to 2020 to 2024, way beneath the fold in America, nobody's paying attention, is 96 miles from the Russian border in Finland, Lapland. The United States is leading NATO artillery exercises. That's something I would not have said 4 years ago or 8 years ago. What is the significance of NATO artillery exercises a Cuba away from Putin's border?
That speaks to the fact that we have two new NATO member states since Russia decided to invade Ukraine, and those are Finland and Sweden. It wasn't expected. I suppose even 5 years ago, I actually had a bet with a Swedish banker friend of mine about this, that they would both join. But you take us to an interesting place, Tom, which is that one of the sort of open debates that's underway is whether those Nordic states would kind of form their own mini NATO if U.S. withdraws its support in one form or another. They have strong militaries and have had the mandatory draft. And I think a lot of Americans don't appreciate how prepared those countries are. Finland was at war with Russia, remember, and has a memory of being at war to defend their territory, but they do rely on U.S. participation.
This came up last night at the dining room table. Tina Fordham, if President Trump wins a second term, where does he travel to first? Does he redux his Pacific travels? Does he go to Europe? Will he try to redo 2016?
So I actually haven't thought about that before. I love a thought experiment, Tom, but I don't think that Trump will feel compelled, if he's reelected, to do the traditional calling upon allies. Trump's also not really an ally guy. And if we look at his, campaign statements, they're really focused on the domestic. I mean, my sense is that Trump would likely subcontract his foreign policy, trade policy to experts who he trusts. Of course, the trouble for us is when we try to speculate what that looks like, that most of the people who worked for him before have made it abundantly clear that they would never consider doing so again.
Tina, we got to leave it there. Never enough time. Tina Fordham, Fordham Global Insights.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
There are moments in the blur of all this, folks. There's moments where any of our wonderful esteemed guests, they say one single thing, and like it doesn't go away. You remember it 1 hour, 1 day, 1 month later. Gautam Mukunda said something a while back. I think it was, I missed Gautam last time around because I was in Europe, but with Yale School of Management, said something, Paul, that I carried for weeks and weeks and weeks, which is the undecideds shrink. They shrink much more. And everybody caught up with Professor Mukunda. He joins us now in studio on this election day. Where are the undecideds now? They got to decide.
They have to decide. At this point, everything here is guesses and stabs in the dark. But all the data I'm seeing suggests that in the last 24 to 48 hours, even the last 1 to 2 weeks, they've broken pretty strongly towards Harris. The really decisive moment, and it's striking so, was the Madison Square Garden event. There's a lot of polling data coming out for Latinos, particularly Latinos in Pennsylvania, that they all heard about it. It mattered to all of them, and it swung some votes. Now, I can't tell you that's enough to swing the election because there aren't many of those people. Like the undecided was, last time I was here, it was 3%. It's probably less than that now. And a lot of people had already voted by the time those events happened. But the Harris campaign is not all that quietly anymore, feeling very confident because of what they've seen in the last few days.
We had yesterday, the piece of news that came out was the Seltzer poll coming out of Iowa that surprisingly showed Vice President Kamala Harris 3 points ahead. What'd you make of that?
Earthquake does not understate the impact that one had. Ann Seltzer's record in Iowa is so good that I occasionally make jokes that she's lived in Iowa her whole life. She only does Iowa. She doesn't poll the state. She just knows every Iowa voter and asks them what they'll do. It's not that she's never been wrong. She missed a gubernatorial race a few years ago. But in general, her record is as close to perfect as a pollster can get. For her to say not just that it's close, but that Trump is 3 points down, stunning. I'll add to that. Okay, let's say she had a statistical fluke. It can happen to anyone, even Seltzer. I don't really think Harris is going to win Iowa. The Trump campaign's response was to leak internals saying that they had numbers saying he was 5 points up. That's really bad for Trump. If he's 5 points up, he should be 10 to 15 points up in Iowa. If he's 5 points up in Iowa, that's really bad news for him across the country. Now, the one thing I'd say is it might be Iowa specific. Iowa's abortion ban went active in July, and basically Iowa local elections have been nothing but saturation bombing on abortion. And so that might mean that a swing by white women, that's what Seltzer picked up, based on Dobbs, is more intense in Iowa than it is anywhere else in the country.
Turnout. I'm told that it's particularly important this election, given how close the election appears to be. Does one party have an advantage there in terms of turnout?
So everyone agrees that the Harris turnout machine is much better. Like that's not debate. Even the Trump people will tell you that. It's just much more effective. Partly because the Trump people outsourced their entire turnout operation to Charlie Kirk and Elon Musk, and you can't build these things on the fly. Like, you actually have to spend years doing it. That being said, Trump had essentially no turnout in operation in 2016. None. And he got people who a Democratic turnout machine would have just written off as not worth approaching. Mm-hmm. He got them to show up and vote for him. There's nothing that helps your turnout more than a clear, consistent message by a charismatic candidate. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, that is a pretty good description of his campaign.
What do you think? Is Pennsylvania the state we should be focusing on, or are there some other places we should be looking?
I would start with Pennsylvania. So I'd say it's harder to get early info from states than it is from particular areas. So it varies from election to election. But I'll tell you, in 2016, I was looking at some areas in Virginia. And I was in China, of all things. I was doing election commentary in Beijing, among the strangest experiences of my life. And so about 9 p.m. local time, which would have been 9 a.m. local time, which would have been 9 p.m. time here, I got those results and turned to some people next to me and said, I think Lynn's going to lose. Mm-hmm. This time, there's actually Pennsylvania, yes, also Delaware. They're oddly, obviously they're going to win Delaware, but if it's closer than you expect, that would be a pretty bad sign for Harris.
Picking presidents. Mr. Trump is unique. Let's all, even his supporters will agree, it's a unique process. What have we learned, your wonderful book, Picking Presidents, what have we learned about picking presidents that prepares us for 2028?
I think counterintuitively, the thing maybe we should learn is the campaigns are just too long. I think Harris got a real benefit from being, maybe this was too short for her, but the 2-year-long election cycle that we've been doing for presidential campaigns, it drives everyone insane. It forces people to take positions that end up being completely indefensible.
So to be clear here, for Vice President Harris, she had an advantage because of the delay.
I won't say, I think she would rather have had a normal cycle, and I have to give her credit for being able to perform this balancing act in this short span of time. But if I were a normal candidate, I would rather do 6 months than 2 years.
Charlie Cook led his before-election essay with, we grew up with landslides. Yeah. I was explaining at home what they did to McGovern in 72. That's beyond the realm of how we think now. Do you desire, Professor, that we get back to landslides, back to where we vote for somebody with an image, or are we just wedded to this polarity forever?
So I don't think we are. We saw a landslide in 2008, and 2012 was not that close. This polarity is deeply aberrational. And I'll say, speaking as a political scientist for a second, we don't really understand why. We don't have good theories as to what is going on, as to why the elections are so perfectly balanced right now. I think the American political system basically does not work when it is in deadlock. Other political systems do.
But to the laureates at MIT, is it, in the Power and Progress, is it just a separation of the nation here between the haves and the have-nots? Is that really all this comes down to?
I don't think so. I think that is a driving issue, but although the Trump campaign sort of set image of itself that it portrays as of the working class tribunal, Trump voters are significantly wealthier than Harris voters. They were significantly wealthier than Biden voters in 2020. They will be significantly wealthier than Harris was in 2024. And so you have a real conflict between the image of the campaigns and their voter base, and that is going to be resolved eventually, but it might take a while.
Can't wait to talk to you after this election. Gautam Mukunda with us, of course, of Yale, his book, Picking Presidents, How to Make the Most Consequential Decision in the World.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Dan Tobon joins us from Citigroup and, of course, his London watch for them. And he's, of course, with FX there, G10 FX Strategy at Citigroup. So if you bracket Euro, Trump, Harris, Euro right now is, I'm looking at Dan, my eyes are failing me, at 109. With Trump, where's Euro? With Harris, where's Euro?
Yeah, well, I mean, very simply, if Trump wins, euro dollar goes down, potentially all the way towards around 105. That'd probably be a bit of a stretch, but it could get down that far. If Harris wins, euro higher, at least back to 110. But there might be some difficulty getting higher than that simply because data in the U.S. has been outperforming the euro.
So with Harris, the euro strengthens. It's asymmetric. Is it about euro stronger or is it sell the dollar with Harris?
No, this is absolutely about the dollar. And actually, there's dollar yen would be a trade we'd be looking at more because
bracket that, please.
It's a proxy.
152.
It's a proxy for rates. And so rates should go down. Yields should go down if we see a Harris win, and so dollar yen should go down as well.
Since the beginning of time, when I think about trading currencies, I think about Citibank and Citi. Now, you guys are New York, London, Asia. You trade everything. How are you guys staffing up for the next 12 to 24 hours globally, currency desk at Citi?
Oh, it's going to be busy, and it's going to be all hands on deck, at least tonight, until we have, probably until midnight. We have to see how the results are coming out. But certainly 24/7, we will have staff, and we will be there for
what
clients.
Currency pair, what indicator of FX is what Dan Tobin's going to watch off the Bloomberg at Citi?
I'm going to be watching dollar yen and dollar mex. Those will be the two key ones to keep an eye on.
Talk to us about dollar Mexican peso. What's the relationship there? What's driving that trade these days?
Dollar mex has a lot of domestic stories, but it's also sensitive to the U.S. dynamic if Trump wins, both because the USMCA will come under review, and so there's some potential uncertainty around there, and also because there's been a lot of border disputes, so mex just comes into focus and remains one of the key
So
currencies.
mex is 20.13. If Trump is going to win or appear to win, it weakens to 21.22.
In that area, it's hard to say overnight, but certainly potential.
Yeah, I don't need, it's completely unfair, but the direction.
Absolutely, that's the right
Like when you talk to your clients, do you feel like they're hedged today? Are they making bets today? Are they just saying, I'm on the sidelines today? Because there will be movements in your market.
Yeah, absolutely. For the most part, the big accounts have really reduced positioning and are trying to go in as lightly positioned as possible. The more active clients, they're long dollar. They've reduced some of that. They were a lot more long dollar last week when Trump odds were a bit higher. Still leaning towards long dollar, though.
So, all right, let's go 72 hours, 3, 4, 5 days from now. What do you think?
Long term.
Let's get back to more fundamentals. What's your view here of the currency markets? Where do you see value here?
Yeah, probably outside of the dollar, we'd be looking at things like the Australian dollar, actually. There's a lot of value there just because the domestic story is strong and there's potential for some hedge changes next year. At the end of the day, though, the data in the U.S. is still holding up, and so it's hard to see a real big sell-off coming for the dollar. Even if Harris wins and the dollar sells off, it probably will be momentary, and the dollar could probably rally back.
Do you have G10, it's not, but China, how do you affect a China trade given the Congress coming out, presume fiscal support, more help, et cetera? How does Citigroup affect a China belief?
Yeah, I mean, the key question is going to be what kind of tariffs do we get if we do, in fact, get a Trump presidency? And to offset that, what kind of stimulus are we going to get from the Chinese side? And we do have the standing committee meeting on November 8th. So there will potentially be a lot of volatility around the currency. But very simply, if Trump wins, we expect dollar CNH to move higher. If Harris wins, we can actually see dollar CNH more stable.
The pound sterling, what's the call there? How do you feel about sterling right here?
Structurally, we like it. We think there's opportunity for investors, which have been very underweight the UK since Brexit, to start moving assets back into the UK. Gilt yields look somewhat attractive here. So we see potential for a stronger sterling, especially against the euro into next year. But in the short term, it's not trading to its domestic fundamentals. It's trading to concerns around the budget and across the US election.
One final question. You do technicals, which we do a lot here in surveillance. Technicals on radio really work. and the answer here is, when someone says the vector in the dollar is strong dollar, is there an established trend? I call it soup, or is it technically just soup where the dollar is right now?
If we pull out far enough, there is a very clear trend since the great financial crisis for a stronger dollar. And in fact, the US has been the outperforming economy in the global developed markets.
So does it get you on yen through 160? I mean, Gartman's framing it for gold, but that's Gartman making gold chat. Can you, as a major bank, frame out a fan distribution that gets a yen back out over 160?
That would require a much higher U.S. 10-year yield. And given that the Fed is already in a cutting cycle, and that in general we're seeing a bit of a slowdown in the U.S., it's hard to see that absent some kind of fiscal shock. Now, that's not impossible, given we have a potential red wave coming, but it's hard for us to see that. We actually think the yen can strengthen into next year.
Like Paul said, you're everywhere. Where are you based for Citigroup? Are you in like Dubai or?
I'm in New York, but I've worked all over for Citi.
They're everywhere. I'm actually, if you want to go trade some obscure currency, they got to be your first call.
You read Dan Tobon's resume, and it's like the romance of FX and big bank. I mean, he came out of Villanova and he's sipping tea in Mayfair. What's that about?
I know.
Oh, Citi is the FX bank, and London is a place.
What was your first day like in Citigroup? Was it like the TV show industry?
Oh no! It was it was actually great. I've loved working there. I've been there for over a decade. I did leave and I came back because I loved it so much.
Great. Dan Tobon, don't be a stranger. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
With Citigroup, he's had a G10 FX at Citigroup.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.
Joining us right now, the last time he was on, he was hugely knowledgeable, Paul. I was blown away. Benedikt Kammel joins us. Why don't you bring him in on? You nailed it. I mean, you told me the strike's not going to get settled last time, and this time was different.
Yeah, it's they finally, we got the rank and file Tom over at Boeing, the machinists up there in the Pacific Northwest agreeing to a contract with Boeing. A piece of good news for them and for the company and for the stock. The stock's up about 1.3% in pre-market trading. Benedikt Kammel joins us, global aviation editorial leader for Bloomberg News. He's based in Berlin, Germany. Benedikt, what's different for this contract versus the last contract? Is it simply dollars and cents?
There's a bit of that. I think the numbers are slightly better. We had now a 38% wage increase. Last time it was 35, so up a smidge. But I think the bigger difference is that there was a general weariness, and you could see it in the faces of the workers, of the union leadership. I think everyone was ready to get this done with, and they probably felt this is as good as it's going to get. Any more holdouts and any more negative votes, we might actually start hurting ourselves more than we start benefiting from this. So there was this sense, this is a pretty good deal. It's a 38% wage increase over a couple of years. There's a big signing bonus. There's a couple of other sweeteners thrown in. And we're moving towards Thanksgiving. People's savings are depleted. People, starting to get cold over there. The joys of standing by the roadside with a sign in your hand are probably rapidly diminishing. So there was that sense, let's get it done with. This is good. And that's where we got 59% approval. Okay, mathematically all they needed, but not great if you want to repair relations.
So what's the company saying about their ability to kind of restart the assembly line and get those planes coming out of the assembly line, getting them to customers? And and bringing in cash flow into the company. What's the company saying about timing?
Well, there's no absolute perfect sense of timing here, but they have said it's going to take a while. Kelly Ortberg, the CEO, said a couple of weeks ago, it's much easier to turn things off than it is to turn them back on again. As we all know, fixing something is harder than breaking it. So it will take months, it'll take into next year. To give you a sense, they have said this year will be a cash negative year. They'll have cash outflow. And the next year, the first half, will also be cash negative. And that was, to many people, a surprise. People thought that come early next year, things would be back in repair mode and sort of the company would be on a road to recovery. But clearly, we're looking into the latter part of next year when that'll happen. So this year, they will have burnt about $14 billion of cash. That gives you a sense of just how high the stakes were. And even a company the size of Boeing can't do this forever. So the stakes are really high for both sides to get this deal over the line.
Benedikt, our advantage with you is you're in Berlin, so you get the Toulouse, France Airbus axis. Has Airbus had any advantage from this strike?
Only in so much that people aren't looking at their problems as much as they are at Boeing's. And, Airbus is not without its own faults. Their production is not where it should be. It's not as bad as Boeing's. They are actually producing planes, whereas Boeing right now is close to zero. But they have huge supply chain issues. They have had to cut back their output targets for the year. But people are obviously far more fixated on what's going on at Boeing than they are at Airbus. But it's a complicated market where you can't simply switch from one supplier to the other. So even if you were a Ryanair, which is a Boeing customer, and we had the Ryanair CEO in the studio yesterday, and he was saying, look, I'm not getting the planes I need. I need them for the peak summer period, and they're not coming in. He can't just pick up the phone to Guillaume Faury, the CEO of Airbus, and say, hey, can you sell me a couple of planes? So everyone is kind of locked in, the situation they're in, and everyone is really hoping for this to resolve itself. And this strike, the end of the strike, is one big step towards that.
Benedikt, our Ute, back any countless elections, certainly back to 68 and 72 in the Vietnam War, is the defense component of aviation, whether it's Lockheed Martin or McDonnell Douglas, et cetera, et cetera. And the answer, Benedikt, is it's a big distraction. Is Boeing distracted or hindered because of their defense institutional place in America?
Well, I mean, defense is still a big component of Boeing, and it's also part of the reason why, a lot of people have said, is this a company too big to fail? And yes, it is, because they have that big foot in the door on all things defense. And if you compare it to Airbus, it's a much more sizable part of their operation and a more important part. So whatever Boeing looks like in 3, 5, 10 years, the defense component will still be there, and it will be an important part of what they do. It's a different question when you start thinking about space, for instance. Yes, they have this long history of, helping put a man on the moon and all that, but the space business is really where they're bleeding and where they're hurting. So if you look at what they have to do, and Kelly Ortberg, the CEO, has been quite open about this. He says, we can't be everything to everyone. We have to really think hard about what we're good at, where we make our money, and where we might have to make some painful cuts. And if I had to guess, it's probably going to be in the space area more than in the defense market.
Benedikt, what are the Boeing's customers saying? Are they still standing by the company? Again, it's just a duopoly out there. I guess they don't have much of a choice there for your Southwest Airlines and some other airlines that depend upon Boeing. But what have the customers been saying?
They are, and they're standing with them, and they're saying, we want Boeing to succeed. And oddly, you'd think Airbus is actually saying the same thing. They're saying, we take no joy. I mean, maybe secretly they might take a little bit, but openly they will say, we take no joy in Boeing's misfortunes here, because we are sort of tied at the hip with these guys, and we need them to succeed. We need a healthy market out there. And as I said, if you're a United, if you're an American, if you're a Southwest, you can't just sort of switch back and forth. You have these long-term contracts, you have your crew training, you have your maintenance. All of those things are tied into these decades-long contracts that you have with these suppliers, and therefore they need Boeing to succeed. Yeah. And as you say, there isn't really much of a choice out there. The Chinese, there are making some noises. There was a Comac 919 but that plane is not certified in the Western Hemisphere. So it'll be years. Who knows whether we on this call will ever see that plane flying in our time zone. But it'll come at some point, but that's far out.
Benedikt, absolutely spectacular. Thank you so much. Benedikt Kammel, worldwide, driving our airline coverage.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.